Hi everyone, my name is Dave and welcome to Extra Credit, a video series where we take an unscripted look at topics related to local history and exploring that history. All right, so before we get into today's video, as we normally do, I just wanted to remind everyone, first of all, to take a look at my website. There is a link in the description. My website has all kinds of information related to the topics that we take a look at in this video series, as well as the explorations and the hikes that I do. You can also get information from my social media pages, so please make sure you visit my Facebook, my Twitter, and my Instagram and give those a like. And finally, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. There's a lot of content that goes up on this YouTube channel, particularly in the spring and the summer and the fall months when I'm out sort of hiking and exploring. And by subscribing and hitting that notification button, you'll get those posts quicker than they will oftentimes, because there is a bit of a lag and a delay between the time that I do post the videos on YouTube and sometimes when they make it onto social media. So today's episode, as you saw at the beginning of the video, is about the Kinghorn. And so before I actually get into talking a little bit about kind of how this story sort of evolved, what I need to do is I need to explain what I'm talking about when I'm saying the Kinghorn. And so essentially the Kinghorn is kind of not quite a nickname, it is kind of the proper name, but basically what it's referring to is a portion of a rail line. And so the Kinghorn refers to specifically the Canadian National Railway Kinghorn Subdivision. If you're not aware of this, basically railway companies divide their railway lines into segments that are known as subdivisions. And the subdivisions can range in terms of their length from potentially a few miles to several hundred miles. The Kinghorn subdivision, by the time it was torn up, by the time it was discontinued by CN, was almost 200 miles long. Its history dates back over 100 years back. Construction began on that line back in 1911. The company that actually built it was known as the Canadian Northern Railway. And basically the Canadian Northern Railway was one of the predecessor companies to Canadian National. So Canadian Northern Railway had gotten its start basically back before the turn of the last century. In essentially 1896, they began sort of acquiring and constructing railway lines kind of in Manitoba. And then you probably hear these if you watch my exploration videos, you kind of hear sort of the same description. And then basically their first big project was building a railway line from the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, to Winnipeg. And that was completed in 1902. And then they began building more railway lines throughout the prairies. And then they began building and acquiring railway lines north from Toronto, eventually reaching up into the Sudbury area. And then eventually they kind of realized that they sort of, in order for the company to kind of move forward, they would need sort of a transcontinental line. They didn't really want to build between the Sudbury area, specifically Ruel, which is where their lines kind of terminated, and Port Arthur, because it was going to be a very kind of long stretch of construction. It was over 500 miles. And it was going to be very, very difficult to construct. Building through this part of the country, through the Canadian Shield, is very challenging. And so they knew that it was going to be challenging. They knew it was going to be very expensive. So they did try to basically come up with an agreement with Canadian Pacific Railway and try to sort of lease or share their lines. And they weren't able to do that. And there's a lot more to this story as well. I'm kind of giving you sort of the abbreviated version to all of this. Eventually their hand was forced and they sort of had to sort of start building this line on their own. And so construction began in 1911 and was completed in 1914. Actually, on New Year's Day, 1914 was when the last spike was driven. It wasn't until the following year, it wasn't until 1915 that sort of service on the, what eventually became the Kinghorn subdivision began, and that was in October of 1915. Now, eventually what happened was Canadian Northern Railway, because of the construction projects like on what would become the Kinghorn line and through the mountains of British Columbia, eventually started running into financial difficulties. And by 1917, the company was in some serious financial problems, had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And then in 1918, They were basically amalgamated or merged with another group of government-owned bankrupt railway lines known as the Canadian Government Railways. And that merger essentially formed a company that became known as Canadian National Railways. And so that's kind of where the sort of the Canadian Northern story kind of ends. And so essentially what became the Canadian Northern Railway was actually two sections, sorry, the Canadian National Railways was actually two sections of the Canadian Northern Railway. The more eastern section, part of it was known as the Canadian Northern Railway Longlac Subdivision, which ran from a place called Hornpain to Jellicoe, and then from Jellicoe to Port Arthur, that section was known as the Nipigon Subdivision. Now, when the line became part of Canadian National Railways, the Longlac Subdivision became the Longlac Subdivision, basically named after the community of Longlac, which still exists today. And then the section from Jellicoe to Port Arthur became the Dorian Subdivision. And then eventually what ended up happening was when sort of Canadian National Railways was constituted, the two big railways that became part of their network were the Canadian Northern, which I just finished talking about, and the Grand Trunk system. And so basically the Grand Trunk had built in partnership with the Canadian government another transcontinental line that kind of ran north of the Canadian Northern line. And so eventually what Canadian National Railways decided to do was they decided to build a piece of line or an extension between Longlac and the community of Nakina, and that became known as the Nakina Cutoff. And what it did was it essentially linked the Grand Trunk line, which that part of it was known as the National Transcontinental, and the Canadian Northern line. What that did was it basically shortened the distance that trains had to travel between Winnipeg and Toronto. Because trains traveling through what today is Thunder Bay basically had to travel down close to Lake Superior and then back up. And so it essentially cut about 100 miles of rail off the line. And so by doing that, basically the old Canadian Northern line from Longlac to Port Arthur, sort of ceased to be important anymore. And so eventually what ended up happening was the piece of line from Longlac to Jellicoe became known as the Kinghorn Subdivision. It was just under 50 miles long. And then the section of line between Jellicoe and Port Arthur kept its name, the Dorian Subdivision. And they kind of operated like that until 1960. And in 1960, a couple significant things happened. First of all, Canadian National changed its name from the Canadian National Railways, plural, to the Canadian National Railway. That year, they adopted their very iconic logo, which they still use today. That kind of squiggly CN line is sometimes called the worm logo. So that was adopted in 1960. In 1960, they basically merged the two rail lines. So the Kinghorn Subdivision and the Dorian Subdivision were merged into one line, and eventually the whole thing became known as the Kinghorn Subdivision, running from Longlac to Port Arthur, which would eventually become Thunder Bay. So that's kind of the history of that line. It operated until 2005 when CN decided to discontinue service. Bunch of reasons for that. Essentially, there was really next to no traffic on the line. CN basically kept it as a redundancy in case their main line went down. Around that time, just prior to that, CN had actually acquired a number of rail lines in the upper Midwest of the United States. And by doing so, that gave them basically a complete rail line around the Great Lakes to the south through the United States. And so essentially, they no longer needed the Kinghorn Subdivision. Again, there was no sort of traffic, and its redundancy value had sort of disappeared. And so that way they decided to sort of get rid of the line. And so that sort of brings us to our explorations of that rail line and trying to sort of document it. All right, so now that you know a little bit of sort of the history of the Kinghorn, what I want to do is basically talk to you a little bit about how I kind of got involved in all of this. So if you've watched some of these extra credit episodes, particularly the first one where I sort of talk a little bit about how I kind of got into exploring some of the history of the area, particularly the rail history of this area, I sort of go into detail about, how this all kind of got started for me back in the 90s and, with the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western Railway. So I basically, for the most part, had kind of explored the PD for the better part of, and researched the PD for the better part of about 20 years. And eventually what ended up happening was as time was going on. Now, that just to give you a kind of quick little recap about the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western, or the PD, as most people kind of refer to it in this area, that line was basically built as a line. It was a locally inspired line. Basically, the purpose of it was to, first of all, access silver that had been located southwest of the then city of Port Arthur. Eventually, iron was discovered as well, and so they were going to tap into iron, and as well build a rail link from the Canadian lakehead to the American lakehead to Duluth, Minnesota. Unfortunately, the railway line was never completed. The iron and silver mines that were supposed to sustain the railway line basically closed, and essentially the railway line was left without sort of any type of revenue. And so slowly but surely the line was sort of abandoned. In 1899, it was actually purchased by Canadian Northern, and it was actually one of the first rail lines to be incorporated into the Canadian Northern Rail network. So it actually sort of ties in with today's story a little bit. Eventually, as I said, in bits and pieces, the PD was abandoned, and finally the whole rail line was torn up. Abandoned in 1938 and torn up in 1939. And so it had been a long period of time since the PD had operated. And essentially what I was finding was that as time was going on, it was becoming harder and harder to do, sort of the hikes and the explorations on the PD rail line. When I had first started in the early 90s, there were parts that were not necessarily easily traversable, but I mean, certainly there was, you could sort of get around, but as time was going on, I was finding was becoming a lot more challenging. Areas were becoming grown in. There was a lot of areas that had been damaged. Basically, pretty much every bridge was gone on the line. Bridges, culverts, things like that had disappeared. There were portions of the line that were privately owned. And so basically CN kept the right of way up until the late 1980s. And then they basically decided to sort of get rid of it. And whatever pieces that were not purchased went back to the Crown, basically went back to the government of Ontario, which was most of the line, but there were a few pieces here and there that people bought. And so, it's not possible to sort of, hike on every single sort of portion of the line. And so what I was finding over the years, it was becoming harder and harder to kind of, explore and visit some of the areas and sort of document sort of what was going on. And there was less and less to find. There was, taken point, North Lake Station. So North Lake was at milepost 71 of the railway. And Canadian Northern had built a very large station there in 1907. And when I first began exploring the PD, you could basically see remains of the station. The area where the station was, there was an open area where the station was. You could still see the coal bunker with the coal in there. I mean, eventually it got to the point where you couldn't even, if you didn't even know where to look for it anymore, you couldn't find it. And so I was finding it was becoming a very, very big challenge to kind of, just hiking and exploring on the PD. And at the same time that was happening, sort of, there were changes that were sort of going on in my life. Probably one of the big ones was that my wife and I and our kids, we were spending a little bit more time at at her parents' place, which is where I am right here. Obviously, this is not located anywhere near the PD. We're kind of northeast of Thunder Bay, which is close to the Kinghorn line. And so, it was becoming a lot more challenging for me to kind of get out into some of the areas of the PD simply because, again, logistically, we were spending more time out here. Sort of the big pivotal year, which kind of changed things was in 2016. My wife and I basically inherited this place from her parents after they passed. And so we basically, taking over this place, we sort of wanted to spend more time here, and sort of that created a huge disconnect, from the PD, just physically not sort of being in the area, and again, coupled with the fact that, it was getting harder and harder to, to explore, and so. I didn't really know a lot about sort of the Kinghorn rail line. I knew that there was a rail line that had basically run, from Thunder Bay up to Longlac, and I knew that the rails had sort of been torn out. And I could sort of remember, seeing trains kind of passing along, and certainly every time I drive out here, I pass by the Pass Lake Trestle, or the Blend River Viaduct, or its proper name is. So I pass by that every time, and sort of that's a big sort of physical reminder of the line. And so as we were spending more and more time out here, I decided, well, I mean, it's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of follow the PD. Maybe I should sort of branch out and take a look at some other rail lines. And so in the summer of 2018 was my first sort of little exploration that I did on the Kinghorn. So my boys and I basically packed up our bikes and drove down to where Pass Lake Station was. Again, we've done some explorations around Pass Lake, and maybe I'll post a link up there. And so essentially we drove down there and essentially went for a little bike ride along the railway grade. And again, that was one of those areas of the line that I sort of recollect a lot. Maybe not a lot, but certainly driving down to places like, Sleeping Giant Provincial Park and Silver Islet, you would drive by, and the railway grade is just right beside the highway as you sort of pass the Pass Lake itself, the physical lake itself. And again, it sort of stuck in my mind, and I sort of thought, well, maybe we should go and have a look at this. And so as I'm talking about this, I'll kind of post some pictures up. And so basically we rode our bikes, and we kind of rode kind of north, all the way from where the station was. We probably rode about, I would say probably about 4 miles or so, roughly from, where the station was, which is essentially around milepost 170 something up to about, 165, 166, whatever that milepost is, on the Kinghorn. And I was sort of not necessarily mesmerized, but sort of intrigued by what I had seen, sort of the rock cuts, and you would see some of the milepost markers, and just by the, the ability to actually ride on, part of that grade, so used to, the PD where, there are sections where you can drive on, things like that, but those are sort of few and far between. Most of the sections of the PD are very, very heavily grown in. And again, I'll sort of show some pictures of that. Probably the clearest areas are probably closer to the border, where there's at times roads or snowmobile trails. In Minnesota, they actually built some hiking trails along parts of the railway grade. So I was kind of blown away the fact that you could actually just sort of travel on this grade, and you could actually kind of ride your bike along, and you're not kind of dodging through the brush and the trees and things like that. So that was my first trip back in 2018. And the next year in 2019, I decided to kind of do a little bit more. And so most of my hikes, again, were kind of in that sort of same area, very close to where camp is here. And so I did a hike actually kind of east from Pass Lake, going from Pass Lake all the way up to the viaduct to the trestle. And I was able to kind of take a look at that part of the grade. And then I did a couple of hikes north of Pass Lake, kind of in the area where Pearl Station was, and where the railway grade crosses a road known as Road 5 South in Pearl. And actually, that's probably the closest area where the railway grade is into proximity where we are here. It's probably less than about a 10-minute drive to Road 5 South. And so again, I did some sort of hikes in that area. And then kind of over the next winter, so the winter of 2019, 2020, I sort of started thinking a little bit more, and I sort of thought, there was some, I wanted to kind of do a little bit more exploring on the Kinghorn. But at the same time, there was another sort of railway line that I wanted to explore that I had looked at parts of back in the 90s. And that was a railway line that had been built by Grand Trunk. And if you remember earlier in the video, I'd mentioned the Grand Trunk line. So their line was basically kind of way north of Lake Superior. And again, the way that the arrangement worked was Grand Trunk built their line, known as the Grand Trunk Pacific, from Winnipeg to the West Coast. And then the eastern portion from Winnipeg to New Brunswick was known as the National Transcontinental, and that was built by the Canadian government. They did want to have access to Lake Superior, so they built a branch, and it was known as the Lake Superior branch, that went from what was originally known as Graham, and eventually became Sioux Lookout, basically branched down. And eventually, when CN took over, that line became known as the Graham Subdivision, which is what most people kind of remember it as. And that line was abandoned back in 1994. And so I had actually taken a look at sort of parts of that rail line. There was a bridge over the Matawan River that I had looked at, and there's a tunnel called the Flett Tunnel that's kind of in that same area. So I wanted to explore parts of that rail line as well. And so that sort of spring of 2020, I actually did hikes on the Kinghorn, and I did some hikes on the Graham Subdivision, kind of helped by the fact that we were kind of right at the beginning of the sort of the COVID situation, and you were kind of, at home. And, there was a lot more sort of spare time on the weekends and things like that, trying to stay away from people and trying to physically distance. So hiking was a great thing. Eventually, I sort of came to a crossroads, and it was, kind of a decision time that it was becoming kind of very logistically difficult to kind of do these two kind of very physically different railway lines, one kind of being east of Thunder Bay and one kind of being west of Thunder Bay. What was I going to kind of do? And so eventually what I did was I decided that I was going to focus my attention on the Kinghorn. And the reason for that was obviously having the camp here and being physically close to the Kinghorn line certainly made it a lot easier for me to explore parts of it. But the other big one was the fact that because it had been sort of pulled up not that long ago. So again, the line was discontinued in 2005, and CN pulled up the rails between 2008 and 2010. So it really hadn't been that long since the rails had sort of disappeared. And in comparison to the Graham Subdivision, which had been abandoned in 1994, the Kinghorn was obviously in much better shape from a sort of historical perspective. A lot of the infrastructure was obviously still very pristine. There was a lot of sort of remnants. Parts of the Graham Subdivision had been used, or good chunks of it had been used as a logging road for many, many years, right from the time that it was abandoned. And so that line really had lost a lot of its sort of appearances. It wasn't, again, that sort of pristine line kind of that the Kinghorn was. And, just sort of exploring the parts, there's one part that sort of sticks in my mind right now, just west of the Flett Tunnel, right before there's a large kind of bridge just before Griff Station. One of the neat things that Grand Trunk did is they named all their stations alphabetically, right? So starting from Port Arthur or Fort William, where the rail line was, Alba, Baird, Crest, Dona, Ellis, Flett, Griff. So just before Griff, there was a large bridge, and just before that, there was a rock cut, and it had been so beaten up by these logging trucks driving back and forth that there was this mammoth puddle. Okay, and I'm talking about like it was like flooded, like the grade had been literally flooded to the point where you had to sort of walk around this I couldn't even ride my bike through. And so there was, things like that that sort of kind of tipped my decision to explore more of the Kinghorn line. And so starting in 2020, in that sort of summer, I began kind of branching out. So in late June, I believe, my boys and I made our first kind of little road trip. And so we drove up to McDermott and had a look at the tunnel at McDermott and the nearby bridge over the Pustagony River. And from then, I began sort of exploring more of the grade there, basically working my way um, from the Pustagony River along Pichetawabic Bay, Orient Bay. And then eventually I worked my way all the way down close to Nipigon. And then from there, kind of exploring from Red Rock all the way kind of to back to sort of Pearl. And from there, it just sort of, I decided that I was going to document this whole line. And, I don't know if I was sort of a moment of craziness because, again, the line is almost 200 miles long. And some parts are really easy to get to. Certainly parts that are sort of close by here, where it's just a few minute drive from camp or, a short drive from home. But I mean, when you're talking about parts of the railway grade that are up in the Geraldton, Longlac area, it's a bit more of a hike. Just going to a place like Jellicoe is a 2-hour drive from here at camp, never mind from Thunder Bay. And, when you're talking about Longlac now, you're pushing into, almost 3 hours to drive into that particular area. So essentially, this is kind of where this whole sort of interest in this Kinghorn rail line kind of got started and how it's kind of unfolded over the past few years. And I spent last summer, last fall, doing quite a number of explorations, learning more about the rail lines. One of the things that I've decided to do is actually redo some of those 2020 explorations because my knowledge and my understanding of the rail line and its history has increased quite dramatically from when I did those initial hikes. And so I do need to redo some sections of railway grade. Up to this point now, I've explored probably about 80% of the Kinghorn rail line. So 80% of that 200 miles. I've got some number of hikes that are planned for this year. Hopefully, we can get started at some point soon. One of the interesting things about this video is normally we try to do one every month. And so this was supposed to be February's video, but I wasn't able to get it in February because I actually came out here on this past Monday to film this video. And much to my surprise, we've had a very, very snowy January and February. And when I was out here in January filming January's episode, there was actually less snow here than there was at home. That has changed. And so we probably have just as much snow here as we have at home. And I'll actually flash up a picture of what the front of the camp looks like here. So when I came out here on last Monday to actually film this video, I couldn't film the video because it actually took a couple of hours to try to clean at least a pathway to get into the camp, and that was with the snowblower, and then trying to remove the snow from in front of the door. We're a bit of in a sort of a snow belt in this particular area. So hopefully, when the snow goes away, we can get out and do some more exploration, some exploring. The plan is hopefully to get the entire rail line done this year. And then again, in the process, go back and redo some of those sections. And once that's done, then we need to sort of look at some other options. And there's some things that I'm kind of mulling right now. I don't want to really talk about them, but I do have some sort of options on the table in terms of how I want to sort of move forward with this exploration and this documentation of this rail line. But I will be back with more episodes about the Kinghorn. We will be basically kind of doing a little bit of field work and going and kind of visiting some specific places on the grade, much like we do in our explorations, but kind of sort of pinpointing things and, kind of highlighting certain specific areas. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed today's video and basically talking a little bit about the history and my history with this part of this rail line here in the area. And again, if you're interested, you can tune into those exploration videos. There are quite a number of them. I think probably by the time everything's said and done, once I'm finished doing this, there'll probably be well over 200 videos on the whole rail line. So there is an extensive amount of documentation that kind of has gone on. Anyway, I will wrap things up for today. So thank you very much for tuning in. Please, again, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. And so you get all of those video notifications. There's some really interesting things that are going to be coming up. So in the meantime, we'll be back next month with our next video in the series. So please make sure you tune in. And for now, take care and stay safe.